There is a specific kind of clarity that only exists at 2,000 feet, suspended in the pitch-black sky over a hostile desert. Inside the cockpit of an AH-64 Apache attack helicopter, there is no room for ambiguity. Every switch, every gauge, every data point on the heads-up display is a matter of life and death. You do not survive by hoping for the best. You survive through absolute discipline, rigid adherence to protocol, and the total suppression of unnecessary emotion. My name is Carter. I am 25 years old, a warrant officer, and an aviator in the United States Army. For the last 3 years, my existence has been defined by flight hours, tactical briefings, and the uncompromising weight of the uniform I wear. I chose this life because I believe in the sanctity of order. In the military, expectations are clear. Right is right, wrong is wrong, and actions carry immediate, undeniable consequences. I made the fundamental tactical error of assuming that my own blood operated with the same baseline of honor. My older sister Sarah and I were raised under the same roof, but we might as well have been born in different realities. While I found my purpose in the grueling, merit-based structure of the military, Sarah found hers in the neon-lit superficiality of Miami, Florida. She was 29, unemployed by choice, and entirely consumed by the pursuit of an aesthetic she could not afford. Her life was a meticulously curated, hyper-filtered illusion. To her thousands of social media followers, she was a thriving socialite, posting photos from VIP nightclub sections, oceanfront cabanas, and leased luxury cars. Behind the camera, however, Sarah was a catastrophic financial sinkhole. She survived on predatory payday loans, maxed-out credit cards, and the sheer audacity of robbing Peter to pay Paul. She chased shortcuts to wealth the way an addict chases a high, completely devoid of a moral compass. I loved her out of a sense of biological obligation, but I maintained a strict tactical distance from her chaotic orbit. I kept my perimeter secure. However, when the Department of Defense hands you deployment orders for a high-tempo combat rotation in the Middle East, you have to get your affairs in order. It is standard operating procedure. Before you step onto a C-17 transport plane heading for a war zone, the military requires you to establish a secure footprint stateside. I was single, and my physical assets were minimal. All I had was a checking account where my military pay was deposited, and a 10x10 climate-controlled storage unit in Texas holding my civilian clothes and a few family heirlooms. I needed someone to monitor my physical postal box for tax documents and make sure the $90 monthly fee for the storage unit was paid. That was the entire scope of the mission. Because she was family, I sat down with a judge advocate general at the base legal office and drafted a limited power of attorney, naming Sarah as my agent. The operative word was limited. It was a legal straitjacket. It authorized her to do exactly 2 things: access my mail and disperse funds from a secondary, low-balance account solely to pay the storage facility. It specifically prohibited her from taking out loans in my name, accessing my primary military pay, or making any legal or medical decisions on my behalf. I handed her the notarized paperwork during a brief layover, explained the strict boundaries, and deployed. I went off the grid, fully immersing myself in the exhausting, high-stakes rhythm of combat aviation. I assumed my rear flank was secure. I vastly underestimated the creative potential of a desperate woman with zero integrity. What I did not know while I was sleeping on a dust-covered cot and eating field rations 6,000 miles away was that Sarah's financial house of cards was finally collapsing. Her creditors had stopped calling and started filing lawsuits. The leasing company was threatening to repossess her car, and her landlord had taped an eviction notice to her door. She was backed into a corner, completely stripped of her fake prestige. She did not just need a bailout. She needed a windfall. In a city like Miami, desperation attracts predators. Through the shadowy periphery of the gray market nightclub scene, Sarah was introduced to a man named Julian Vance. Julian was not a street-level criminal. He wore bespoke suits and operated in the high-stakes world of international finance. But Julian was a parasite. He was a foreign national who had orchestrated a massive offshore wire fraud and money laundering syndicate. The authorities in his home country had finally uncovered the paper trail. His overseas accounts were being frozen, and an international extradition warrant was quietly making its way through diplomatic channels. If Julian was sent back, he would spend the rest of his life in a concrete cell. His temporary visa in the United States had expired. He was an illegal alien, and his time was running out. He needed a United States green card, and he needed it immediately. A standard marriage of convenience was out of the question. United States citizenship and immigration services heavily scrutinizes sudden marriages involving foreign nationals with expiring visas. They demand joint bank accounts, shared leases, photographs of a multi-year relationship, and grueling in-person interviews. Julian did not have the time or the evidence to fake a 2-year civilian romance. He needed a bulletproof shield. He needed a cover story so wrapped in the American flag that federal agents would not dare look too closely. He needed to marry an active-duty military officer deployed to a combat zone. It provided an airtight excuse for why the couple was not living together, why there were no recent photographs, and why the husband was handling the immigration paperwork alone. Sarah looked at my life, my uniform, and my absolute isolation in the Middle East, and she did not see a sister serving her country. She saw an asset to be liquidated. The transaction was negotiated with the cold efficiency of a corporate merger. Julian agreed to pay Sarah a staggering broker fee of $400,000 in untraceable offshore funds. In exchange, Sarah guaranteed him a legally binding marriage certificate to a United States Army aviator. There was only one massive logistical obstacle standing in their way. I was in a combat zone. You cannot apply for a marriage license in the state of Florida without both parties being physically present. Furthermore, the limited power of attorney I had left behind did not grant Sarah the authority to apply for a marriage license on my behalf. For a woman facing eviction, federal statutes are merely a minor inconvenience. Guided by Julian's highly paid, ethically bankrupt immigration attorneys, they exploited one of the most obscure legal loopholes in the country. It is called a double proxy marriage. The state of Montana holds a unique position in family law. It is the only state in the Union that permits a double proxy marriage. It is a compassionate legal provision originally enacted during wartime. It allows active-duty military personnel deployed overseas to legally marry their fiancés back home without either party being physically present in the state. As long as one person is on active military duty, the state of Montana allows 2 stand-ins proxies to sign the marriage license on their behalf, provided they have a valid general power of attorney. It is a beautiful law designed to honor the sacrifices of soldiers facing enemy fire. Sarah and Julian weaponized it to commit federal immigration fraud. First, Sarah committed forgery. She took the limited power of attorney I had entrusted her with, scanned it, digitally altered the text to remove all restrictions, and paid a corrupt notary public in her nightlife circle to stamp it. With that single fraudulent piece of paper, she illegally upgraded the document into a general power of attorney. Suddenly, on paper, Sarah had total, unrestricted legal authority over my life, my finances, and my person. Armed with that forged document, Sarah hired a proxy marriage agency in Flathead County, Montana. Operating entirely through the mail, she signed my name on the marriage application. She stood as my legal proxy. Under penalty of perjury, she swore to a local judge that I, Warrant Officer Carter, was deeply in love with Julian Vance and wished to take him as my lawful husband in absentia. Julian's legal team provided a proxy for his side of the paperwork. On a Tuesday afternoon, While I was strapped into a cockpit conducting pre-flight checks on a 30mm chain gun, a judge in Montana struck a gavel. Completely blind, completely unconsenting, and without ever setting foot on American soil, I became a married woman. I was legally tethered to an international fugitive I had never met. The payoff was immediate. The $400,000 cleared into a shell corporation Sarah had established. She walked into a luxury dealership in Coral Gables and bought a brand new Porsche 911 in cash. She paid off her eviction notice, silenced her creditors, and went right back to posting pictures of champagne flutes on yachts. She had successfully sold my honor, my security, and my uniform for a sports car. But Julian Vance was not content with merely securing a marriage certificate to shield him from deportation. He saw the United States military not just as a cover story, but as a host to feed on. Being married to an active-duty military officer is a golden ticket to an incredible array of federal benefits, funded entirely by the American taxpayer. The ink on the Montana marriage certificate was barely dry before Julian submitted it to the United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, filing for an adjustment of status. But he went further. Julian took that same fraudulent marriage license and walked into a military identification facility. He officially registered himself in the Defense Enrollment Eligibility Reporting System known as DEERS. In the eyes of the Department of Defense, he was legally established as my military dependent. Instantly, he gained access to TRICARE Prime, the military's premier health insurance network. A man wanted for international financial crimes was now legally entitled to charge tens of thousands of dollars in private medical treatments to the United States government. More aggressively, his enrollment triggered an automatic update to my military pay status. In the Army, your Basic Allowance for Housing, or BAH, is a non-taxable stipend calculated by your rank and your dependent status. By officially registering as my civilian husband Julian, forced a reclassification of my BAH from the single rate to the with dependents rate. Using the forged power of attorney, Sarah helped him set up a joint bank account, ensuring that the thousands of extra dollars the military was now paying out every month were siphoned directly into his pockets. They had engineered the perfect parasitic ecosystem. Julian was shielded from deportation by the unimpeachable cover of a deployed American soldier siphoning federal funds and utilizing premium military health care. Sarah was wealthy, driving a Porsche and living her Miami fantasy. They assumed the military bureaucracy was a slow, blind dinosaur. They assumed that because I was 8,000 miles away, isolated in a combat zone, I would never notice the administrative changes happening in the background. They banked on the assumption that a soldier's discipline meant I was merely a blunt instrument, trained to follow orders and ignore the noise. They thought they had buried the truth under a mountain of forged paperwork. They forgot that Army aviators are rigorously trained to read complex data. They wire your brain to hunt for anomalies, to track discrepancies, and to neutralize threats with extreme, calculated prejudice. They had laid their trap perfectly in the dark. But the moment my instruments lit up, I would not scream. I would not cry, and I would not negotiate. I would build a trap of my own, and mine would come with the full, devastating weight of the federal government. In military aviation, complacency kills faster than enemy fire. You are trained to constantly scan your instruments, looking for the slightest deviation from the baseline. If a transmission temperature gauge ticks up 2 degrees, you do not ignore it. You isolate the variable, diagnose the system, and execute the emergency procedure. I applied that exact same doctrine to my personal life. It was 0300 hours, local time. I had just walked off the flight line after a grueling 6-hour night vision operation over a hostile sector. My flight suit was soaked with sweat, and the heavy smell of JP-8 aviation fuel clung to my skin. Most of my crew went straight to the mess hall or passed out in their bunks. I went back to my containerized housing unit, opened my encrypted laptop, and inserted my common access card into the reader. It was the end of the month. Standard operating procedure dictates that you log into the Defense Finance and Accounting Service portal MyPay to verify your leave and earnings statement. The military is a massive, unforgiving bureaucracy, and if you do not track your own money, no one will. I pulled up the digital pay stub. Base pay correct, aviation incentive pay correct, imminent danger pay correct. Then my eyes hit the entitlements column. For a single warrant officer living in government quarters, the alphanumeric code for basic allowance for housing is supposed to reflect a status of without dependents. It did not. The code had been altered. It now read W/DEP, with dependents. My monthly housing entitlement had spiked significantly. But my net pay, the amount deposited into my primary checking account, had not changed. I scrolled down to the allotments section, where soldiers can route portions of their pay to different banks. There was a new, active direct deposit. The exact dollar amount of my increased housing allowance was being automatically wired to a private wealth management bank in Miami, Florida. An account I had never opened. I did not blink. I did not panic. I stared at the glowing screen, my brain instantly switching from fatigue to target acquisition. The Department of Defense does not spontaneously classify a single soldier as married and start routing federal funds to South Florida by accident. That requires human intent. It requires legally binding paperwork. I logged out of MyPay and opened my secure military email. There was an unread automated notification from TRICARE, the Department of Defense Health Insurance Network. It was an explanation of benefits regarding a recently processed claim. I opened the encrypted attachment. It was a categorical denial of coverage. A private, out-of-network concierge medical clinic in Miami had attempted to bill TRICARE Prime for $45,000 in unauthorized luxury medical services. I looked at the patient information block. Patient name, Julian Vance. Sponsor name, Warrant Officer Carter. Relationship to sponsor, spouse. The air in my small metal room seemed to freeze. I read the name again. Julian Vance. I had never heard that name in my life, yet, according to the official database of the United States military, he was my husband. I hold a top-secret, sensitive, compartmented information security clearance. It is the absolute highest level of trust the United States government places in an individual. To maintain that clearance, your entire life is subjected to intense, continuous vetting. You cannot have unexplained wealth. You absolutely cannot marry a foreign national without an exhaustive counterintelligence investigation. If the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency discovered that I was legally married to an unvetted civilian and that my military benefits were being actively siphoned to fund him, I would not just lose my flight status. I would be stripped of my clearance, dishonorably discharged, and potentially investigated for espionage conspiracy and defrauding the federal government. Sarah had jeopardized my freedom to fund her lifestyle. I did not pick up my phone. I did not text my sister to demand an explanation. When you are ambushed, you do not stand up and scream at the enemy to ask why they are shooting at you. You assess their positions, you cut off their escape routes, and you call in a precision strike. I locked the reinforced deadbolt of my housing unit. I logged into a secured network bypassing public-facing search engines. Using public records databases, I ran a targeted query from marriage licenses filed in the United States over the last 90 days, containing my name and the name Julian Vance. 20 minutes later, I hit a match in Flathead County, Montana. I paid the municipal fee and downloaded the digitized PDF. As the document rendered on my screen, the entire architecture of the crime revealed itself. It was a certificate of double proxy marriage. I read the document line by line. Under the section for the bride, my name was printed in sterile bureaucratic typography. Below it, signing as my legally authorized proxy, was a sprawling, overly stylized signature I had known since childhood. Sarah. Attached to the file was the supporting documentation she had submitted to the court. It was the limited power of attorney I had entrusted her with, but the text restricting her authority to my storage unit and mail had been expertly scrubbed and digitally altered. She had forged it into a general power of attorney, granting herself total dominion over my identity. A quick background check on Julian Vance filled in the final sickening details. He was a foreign national with a long list of flagged offshore accounts. He was an illegal alien, dodging an extradition treaty desperate for a United States green card. Sarah had not just committed forgery. She had brokered a fraudulent marriage to provide a wealthy, international criminal with a pathway to citizenship using my active duty status as an impenetrable shield against immigration scrutiny. She had sold my honor, my security clearance, and my uniform to a fugitive. She assumed I was stupid. She assumed the distance of a combat deployment would keep me blind and compliant, a silent host for their parasitic fraud. She thought she had outsmarted the system. She fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the United States military. We do not just possess advanced weaponry, we possess the most sophisticated, relentless, legal, and investigative apparatus on the planet. And she had just committed multiple federal felonies on my grid. I saved the forged marriage certificate, the TRICARE denial, and the DFAS routing numbers to an encrypted flash drive. I wiped my search history. I was not going to call her. I was not going to file for a quiet annulment. Annulments are for marital mistakes. You do not annul a parasite. You exterminate it. I looked at my watch. It was 0430 hours. In 2 hours, the base legal office would open. I was going to take my encrypted drive walk into the Judge Advocate General's office and introduce my sister and her phantom husband to the crushing, inescapable weight of the federal government. At 0600 hours, the desert sun was just beginning to bleach the sky over the forward operating base. I walked across the crushed gravel compound to the legal detachment. I did not look like a woman whose family had just betrayed her. I looked like a soldier reporting for duty. I bypassed the waiting area and requested an immediate, closed-door briefing with the senior Judge Advocate General. Major Hayes was a battle-tested officer whose entire career was dedicated to military law. I sat down across from his metal desk, placed my encrypted flash drive in front of him, and delivered a dry, chronological sit-rep. I presented the forged power of attorney, the double proxy marriage certificate from Montana, the altered basic allowance for housing codes, and the denied TRICARE claims. I did not ask for his sympathy. I asked for a tactical legal assessment. Major Hayes plugged in the drive and reviewed the documents in absolute silence. When he finally looked up, the professional distance in his eyes had been replaced by a cold, predatory focus. He confirmed what I already knew. This was no longer a civilian family dispute. It was a multi-jurisdictional federal nightmare. "Warrant Officer Carter," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "Your sister didn't just steal from you. She defrauded the Department of Defense, committed aggravated identity theft, and orchestrated federal immigration fraud. The military does not have jurisdiction over civilians, but I know exactly who does. The military protects its own, and it ruthlessly pursues anyone who attempts to defraud the Department of Defense." Within the hour, I was sitting in a secure teleconference room. Major Hayes had bypassed local authorities entirely and established a direct encrypted video link to Homeland Security investigations and Immigration and Customs Enforcement in Miami. Federal agents do not act on emotion. They act on leverage. As the lead ICE investigator ran Julian Vance's profile through the federal database, he found the golden ticket. Julian's application for an adjustment of status was already in the final stages. Because of his highly complex and questionable background, United States Citizenship and Immigration Services had flagged his file. They were requiring an in-person sworn interview at the federal building in Miami in exactly 9 days. The ICE agent explained the enemy's strategy. Since I was supposedly deployed to a combat zone and could not attend my own immigration interview, Julian was bringing the next best thing. He was bringing Sarah. She was scheduled to attend the interview as my authorized proxy and primary character witness. She was going to sit in a federal building, look a United States immigration officer in the eye, and swear, under penalty of perjury, about the deep, abiding love between her heroic sister and Julian Vance. The agents had enough evidence to arrest them immediately based on the forged power of attorney, but the lead investigator offered a far more devastating alternative. If we arrested them now, it was a paper case. Sarah's high-priced defense attorneys would claim she was a naive victim who misunderstood the paperwork. Julian would claim it was a clerical error. They might plea bargain their way down to probation. But if we let them walk into that federal building, raise their right hands and swear to that lie under oath, the trap would snap shut. Committing perjury in a formal immigration interview elevates the crime to an inescapable mandatory federal prison sentence. We just needed to make sure they felt safe enough to walk into the room. To execute an ambush, your enemy must believe they possess total operational security. They must believe the perimeter is perfectly quiet. I went back to my quarters and drafted an email to my sister. It was a masterpiece of tactical deception. I kept the tone casual, slightly tired, completely mimicking the persona of an exhausted soldier who suspected nothing. I told her that due to an escalating tactical situation in our sector, the base commander was initiating a strict, mandatory communications blackout. I will have no internet, no secure email, and no phone access for the next 30 days, I typed. I am completely off the grid. Don't worry if you don't hear from me. Keep an eye on the storage unit. Love you. I hit send. By establishing a 30-day window of absolute silence, I gave Sarah the ultimate green light. She and Julian would walk into that federal immigration office believing I was trapped in a desert on the other side of the planet, functionally non-existent. With the bait successfully deployed, I needed to position the hammer. I walked into my battalion commander's office, accompanied by Major Hayes. Based on the active federal investigation and the direct threat to my top-secret clearance, I submitted a request for immediate emergency leave. Commanders do not play games with security clearances. He signed the authorization without hesitation, pulling me off the flight roster and quietly processing my transit papers. 24 hours later, I was stripped of my combat gear and sitting in the sterile, dimly lit cargo bay of a C-17 Globemaster military transport plane hurtling across the Atlantic Ocean. I did not sleep during the flight. I methodically reviewed the legal parameters of the operation. In a standard criminal case, defense attorneys can argue coercion, misunderstandings, or administrative errors. But immigration fraud, when committed under oath in a federal facility, is an absolute strict liability nightmare. The moment Sarah and Julian signed that final interview transcript, they would cross the Rubicon. The crime would be fully executed, undeniable, and permanently documented on federal servers. When the military transport touched down at an Air Force base on the East Coast, I bypassed the civilian terminals. I was picked up by a black government SUV driven by 2 armed agents from Homeland Security investigations. As we drove south toward Miami, the neon glow of the city began to bleed into the night sky. It was the city where my sister had built a kingdom of lies, funded by predatory loans and sustained by the systemic abuse of my name. She thought she was a mastermind. She thought she had outplayed the system and secured her future. In the back of the SUV, I unzipped my garment bag. Inside was my Army service uniform, the Class A dress blues. The dark blue fabric was pristine, the creases sharp enough to draw blood. My ribbons were perfectly aligned, measuring my exact history of discipline and service. Tomorrow morning, Sarah was going to tell a federal officer a story about a deployed soldier. I was simply going to ensure the soldier showed up to verify it. The United States Citizenship and Immigration Services Field Office in Miami is not a place where you go to test your luck. It is a sterile, heavily monitored fortress of federal bureaucracy. Every camera is recording. Every document is scrutinized. It is an environment where the United States government decides who is permitted to stay on its soil and who is forcefully removed. At exactly 0900 hours, my sister and her phantom husband walked through the reinforced glass doors. I was not in the crowded waiting room. I was already inside the restricted sector, standing in a dimly lit observation room behind a two-way mirror. I was wearing my Army service uniform, the Class A dress blues. Every brass button was polished to a mirror finish. Every ribbon on my chest was perfectly measured and aligned. The uniform is not just clothing. It carries the absolute, undeniable authority of the United States military. Standing silently beside me were two armed special agents from Homeland Security Investigations and a deputy United States Marshal. Through the glass, we looked into interview room 4. Sitting at the metal table was Julian Vance. He wore a bespoke Italian suit, projecting the relaxed, insulated confidence of a man who believed his offshore wealth made him untouchable. Next to him sat my sister. Sarah looked immaculate. She was dressed in conservative, understated designer clothing, playing the role of the devoted, concerned sibling to absolute perfection. Across the table sat the adjudicating immigration officer. He was a veteran of the agency, fully briefed on the operation. He was the bait. The audio feed piped into our observation room was crystal clear. "Mr. Vance," the officer said, his tone deliberately bureaucratic and mild. "You are applying for an adjustment of status based on your marriage to Warrant Officer Carter, who is currently on active duty." "That is correct," Julian replied, his voice smooth and practiced. "And, ma'am," the officer turned to Sarah, "I understand your sister is currently deployed to a combat zone and cannot be here today to verify the legitimacy of this marriage. You are here serving as her authorized proxy and primary character witness, as granted by the general power of attorney." "Yes, sir," Sarah said, leaning forward and placing a manicured hand over her heart. "It breaks her heart that she can't be here today. She is deployed in a highly volatile sector. We actually haven't been able to speak for days because her base is under a strict communications blackout. She's putting her life on the line for our country, but she begged me to make sure Julian's paperwork was finalized. They are so deeply in love, and he has been a rock for our family." I watched her face through the glass. There was no hesitation, no flicker of guilt. She was delivering a masterclass in sociopathic deception, leveraging my hypothetical death in a combat zone to secure a green card for an international fugitive. "I understand," the officer said, nodding sympathetically. "Let's finalize the record. Mr. Vance, ma'am, I must remind you that lying to a federal officer during an immigration proceeding is a felony. I need you both to raise your right hands." They raised their hands in unison. "Do you swear that all the statements and evidence provided in this interview are the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, under penalty of perjury?" "I do," Julian said. "I do," Sarah echoed. She looked the federal officer dead in the eye and swore to a fabricated reality. The officer slid a printed transcript and a pen across the desk. "Please review the document and sign at the bottom to verify your sworn testimony." I watched the black ink flow from the pen. Julian signed it with a flourish. He handed the pen to Sarah. She took it, signed her name with a steady hand, and pushed the document back across the desk. The moment she lifted her hand from the paper, the legal threshold was crossed. The trap was locked. The crime was no longer a theory or an administrative error. It was a fully documented, federally sworn reality. The officer calmly picked up the signed documents, placed them in a red folder, and stood up. The sympathetic warmth completely vanished from his face. "Thank you both," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "Give me just one moment." He stepped out of the room and closed the heavy primary door behind him. The magnetic lock engaged with a loud metallic thud. Inside the interview room, Julian smiled and leaned back in his chair. Sarah smiled back, letting out a long sigh of relief. They thought they had won. They thought the $400,000 was clean, the Porsche was secured, and the green card was guaranteed. The secondary door connecting to our observation room opened. I stepped into interview room 4. I did not say a word. I simply stood at the head of the table in my full dress uniform, my posture rigid, my eyes locked directly onto my sister. The color drained from Sarah's face so fast it looked like a medical emergency. The smug, triumphant smile vanished, replaced by an expression of primal, paralyzed terror. Her mouth opened, but her vocal cords completely failed her. She stared at me, then at the heavy brass on my jacket, her brain violently rejecting the reality in front of her. She thought I was 8,000 miles away, functionally non-existent in the desert. Julian looked at me, confused, entirely unaware that the woman he was legally married to was standing 3 feet away. Before either of them could formulate a thought, the Homeland security agents flooded the room.
"Julian Vance!"
The lead agent barked, his voice stripping all the oxygen from the small space.
"You are under arrest for federal immigration fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government. Your application for an adjustment of status is permanently denied. Your temporary visa is revoked. You are being transferred directly to an ICE detention facility pending immediate deportation."
Julian panicked, scrambling backward as the agents seized his arms and violently ratcheted heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists.
"Wait, this is a mistake. My wife is an officer in the military."
I looked down at him, my voice perfectly flat and dead. "I am the officer, and I am filing for an immediate annulment on the grounds of criminal fraud. Enjoy your flight home." Sarah finally found her breath. It came out in a high, hysterical pitch. "Carter! Carter, please wait. You don't understand. I was going to pay it back. It was just paperwork. It was a loophole. Carter, please tell them." I did not break protocol. I did not engage in a screaming match. I let the United States Marshal do his job. He stepped up to Sarah, slapped cold steel handcuffs onto her wrists, and read her charges. "Sarah Carter, you are under arrest for aggravated identity theft, forgery of a federal document, perjury, and conspiracy to defraud the Department of Defense." "No, please, I have a lawyer," Sarah sobbed, struggling helplessly against the cuffs. "You're going to need a public defender," the HSI agent replied, securing her wrists tightly. "The Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division executed a warrant on your accounts at 0800 hours this morning. The $400,000 in your offshore shell account has been frozen, and the Porsche you purchased with illicit funds was just impounded from the federal parking garage under asset forfeiture laws. You are completely bankrupt." Sarah collapsed to her knees, hyperventilating and weeping uncontrollably as the marshal dragged her out of the room. She begged for the biological loyalty she had so easily discarded, but I did not even turn my head to watch her go. There was no drawn-out trial. Faced with irrefutable sworn documentation and the crushing weight of multiple federal agencies, their legal defense completely evaporated. Julian Vance's high-priced lawyers could not save him. The fraudulent marriage was instantly annulled, and Immigration and Customs Enforcement executed his deportation order with extreme prejudice. He was placed on a chartered flight in shackles and handed directly over to the authorities in his home country, where he immediately began serving a 20-year sentence for his original financial crimes. Sarah's fate was arguably worse. The federal judge showed absolutely no leniency to a civilian who weaponized military provisions designed to protect deployed soldiers. She was sentenced to a mandatory minimum of 15 years in a federal penitentiary. The $400,000 was permanently seized by the government. The Porsche was auctioned off. She was left with nothing but a concrete cell and a criminal record that would ensure she never touched a line of credit again. I stood in the empty interview room as the federal officer handed me a certified document officially wiping Julian Vance from my military record entirely. My basic allowance for housing was corrected. My security clearance remained pristine. My career was secure. I walked out of the federal building and stepped into the blistering Florida sun. The heat radiated off the concrete, heavy and oppressive, but I breathed in deeply. I had lost my only living family member. But in the military, you learn early on that survival requires sacrifice. You cut away the dead weight to save the aircraft. You eliminate the threat to secure the perimeter. I adjusted my cover, turned away from the city, and headed back to the airport. I had a war to get back to,